All right, well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. I know this is a bright early morning to be talking about some stuff, so I appreciate your time to be here. Hopefully, you will get something good out of this. This session is going to be, I think, only one of two sessions this summit on DSC. I think the third one is in the start or the on-ramp track, but very excited to be talking about this new topic with DSC v3. Before we get too far into this talk, let me just introduce myself. I'm Josh Corrick. I've been attending this summit for almost 7 years now, it feels like, since 2018. I'm an engineer at Microsoft. When I started coming to this conference, I was not an engineer at Microsoft. But if I can't say anything about this conference has helped me grow and network and learn skills that I didn't have when I started. So if this is your first time here, it's a great conference to invest in. All of my roles since then and up till now have been infrastructure focused. So I've done a lot with Linux, Windows, SQL Server. For a while, I contributed to the DBA Tools PowerShell module. Helped a lot with unit test building and stuff. That's actually one of my favorite modules. So if you don't know DBA Tools, go look it up, go use it. It's a great module. I am not on the PowerShell team. I want to be explicit about this because since this is all new stuff that I'm talking about, I don't. If questions come in about like, well, why is it like this? Why is it like that? I'm going to defer to the PowerShell team, to the DSC team. But I read what is publicly available to everybody, and I was like, this is really interesting. I want to learn more about this, and so I submitted this session as a way for me to learn and also to share what I learned with everybody else here. But I'm a PowerShell fan. That's why I'm here. So that's what I'm excited about. We've all seen the vendors out in the hallway here. So if you haven't had time to talk to them at all this week, I think that's pretty much impossible. But if you haven't, please go take a time to thank them for putting this conference on. Big warning for all of the content we're going to talk about. DSC v3 is not yet preview, right? So what that means is what I'm showing as far as developing resources should still be relevant for you guys, everybody who's here, as well as whoever's watching the recording later. But it may have changed. There were some good conversations yesterday in Michael Green's presentation on changes that I think, who knows if it will influence changes to what you're seeing here today. But big warning that's for all of this. Before we get further into the agenda, can I just quick poll of hands, who uses DSC very frequently? Okay. Who is not even sure what DSC stands for? Okay, that's good. Who did not attend the session yesterday that Michael Green did? Okay, good. All right, so I'm going to at least do some level setting for those of you who didn't attend so that at least you can follow along with what goes on later. For those of you who heard Michael's session, maybe this is a little bit of a refresher. But we're just going to do fundamental information about DSC. We're going to set up DSC v3 on a lab machine. And then we'll take a look at some of the command line arguments, because Michael didn't go into that necessarily. He just talked about the features. And then we're going to think about what does it mean to design a resource. Because those of you who raised your hand that said you use DSC heavily in your environment already, you probably have written your own custom version 1, version 2 resources. But v3 resources are quite different. So then we're going to take an example of wrapping an existing binary that we're not writing as a DSC v3 resource. And then we're going to write a new binary that we will then wrap as a DSC v3 resource. So notice here I didn't say anything about PowerShell. Everything here is going to be either managed code or somebody else's managed code. There will be a little bit of PowerShell that we do, but this is not a PowerShell talk. So for those of you who did not attend the talk yesterday or haven't been reading what's going on, here are the changes that are going on with DSC. So DSC v1, v2, we all know and love, PowerShell focused. If you wanted to write a resource, it was PowerShell with a schema moth to define what that PowerShell resource should look like. You had to have PowerShell installed. It was built into version 4 of PowerShell and then 5. Version 3 is being written language and shell agnostic. And I say shell agnostic because we're used to being on Windows potentially and always having PowerShell or PowerShell core installed. But this could potentially run on a Raspberry Pi node or an edge IoT device, or maybe a spaceship someday. Who knows? But more or less, DSC v3 is shell agnostic. Being PowerShell focused, right? For v1, v2, obviously it required PowerShell. v3, no PowerShell required, as I just mentioned. For v1, v2, since it was focused around PowerShell, everything for config data was stored in a PSD1, where you would define configuration and what that configuration should look like, what resources you should use. You would execute the configuration keyword, and that would then compile for you a MOF file, which would then be deployed to your system to make that system configured the way it should be. In v3, config data is ultimately stored in YAML as a human writing it, and then that YAML is converted into JSON and consumed by the DSC v3 engine. This makes it a little bit more flexible. There's not a reliance on MOF, which takes a reliance on some other components. So that's a good change. Another thing that is changing is version 1 of DSC, which a lot of people that probably are heavily using DSC are using v1 if they're in on-premise environments and they're requiring to not use the cloud. The local configuration manager ran as a part of Windows. It was a service that would essentially define, hey, should I make this configuration so? And it would go ahead and apply it. And then if your server system got out of scope, it would reapply the configuration. That went away in v2, or started to go away in v2, but in v3 it is definitely gone. The idea is you bring your own configuration manager. DSC is not a configuration management tool, but it is a reliable API you should be able to trust to interact with lower level systems. But you can snap on top of that any higher level system. Azure Machine Config, Arc, Puppet, Chef, Ansible. My favorite, personally, cron and scheduled task. Anybody out there? Anybody? Okay. Other big changes too is v1, v2, obviously closed to the community. I know that there were efforts to try and open source that engine, but that was just not possible. And in v3, it's starting from the get-go as being open source to the community. You can go look at the source code right now. I don't believe that they're taking any pull requests until it is hopefully past being released. And it's not in preview yet, so it is still an early thing. All right, a couple other things that we need to cover really quickly, just to make sure that people are aware of some key things. I'm assuming that you all know this stuff, but there might be some first-timers here. So a very important thing for DSC v3 is JSON. This is what JSON looks like, just in a rudimentary way. It stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it's a data interchange language. What that means is that it's designed for computers to talk to computers, to pass information between systems. It's basically, if you think of a PowerShell object, it's an object that potentially has key and value pairs, right? We have a key object with a value. We have an array key that has multiple objects in it. We have a subkey that has a key with a value nested inside of a key. And then we have an integer key. If you've done anything with APIs, this is not new to you. And there's the convert to JSON commandlets that exist inside of PowerShell. So maybe you've been struggling to deal with data in some custom system you've written in the past. And so you've been like, oh, I'm just going to convert this to JSON, and then I'll manipulate it, and then I'll convert it back from JSON, and away I go. And this might be a question that you've run into, but is there anything that you might run into with int key, right? As a value, right? Is that actually an int? Is there any way that I can attest that int key is an int? Maybe I could just put a string in there. I mean, it's just text. This is a problem that I've personally ran into in the past designing systems for infrastructure building. is I would create this awesome JSON config because we were like, yes, we love JSON. It's so flexible and easy. And then we would be like, wait, what's this nested property value? Can we be assured that it is only going to have a certain data type in it? Because if it doesn't, it's going to blow up our automation, and we're going to be trying to figure out what's wrong in our build system when really it's the problem in our config that we're passing to our build system, right? So this is another thing that kind of came along more recently than JSON is JSON schema, right? This is a standard that defines the structure, the content, the semantics of what a JSON document should look like. This is an open standard. You can go to jasonschema.org to kind of read more about how this is built and how this is designed. But in this, you get specific properties that are allowed and what the data type of that property should be. So you can take this schema, right, and potentially validate any JSON document you have against that schema and say, is this a valid, actual JSON document? If you've done anything in Azure with like ARM templates, which was a discussion yesterday in the other DSC talk, this is based off of like the ARM templates is very much like this. So if you've done anything with ARM, you're already familiar with this. Another thing that just to cover really quickly is YAML, right? If you've done anything with GitHub pipelines or DevOps pipelines, or if you're doing Kubernetes or Ansible or any of number of systems, YAML is kind of the go-to for humans to write a config nowadays. YAML ain't markup language. I've also always heard it said as yet another markup language, but this is actually the official title of it. And unlike JSON, which is a data, oh man, I forgot what it was. It's a data interchange language. So since JSON is a data interchange language, this is a data serialization language, right? The difference here being that YAML is meant to help us encode ideas, right? And it's then serialized, it's converted then to what computers are friendly with, right? A computer is not necessarily going to parse and read YAML, right? Kubernetes doesn't even do that. They convert it to JSON and then they use the JSON. But we have similar kind of ideas here. We have an array key, we have subkeys, we have keys and values, we have keys with data types. The focus again is on human readability. All right. Any questions before I move forward? I know that's more or less generally known for our industry these days. Okay. All right, so for this first demo, we're just going to look at actually getting DSC installed for us. If you're not familiar with where it's at right now, the project is PowerShell/DSC on GitHub. If you go over to the releases part of this, you can just go ahead and download the binaries directly from here. For instance, whatever processor type you have, you can check the download against the SHA, and then you can scan it for any vulnerabilities if you're really nervous about what the DSC team is doing, but this is all scanned already. Another thing you can do, and this is what I've actually done for the demo, is I've just cloned the entire repo, and I've just built it myself. So I basically have like the nightly build. So we're going to see if my demos survive what Steve pull requested last night at like 11 o'clock at night. We'll get to that. So I've already downloaded this, and I think this is visible from the back. But if you're having any problems seeing this, let me know. I can change on the fly here. So the first thing I'm going to do is there is really no clear guidance about where this new version of DSC should live. It more or less the guidance is it needs to be in your path. Right? You need to be able to find it from just any shell, any place, just execute DSC and it should run. For this demo, I'm going to go ahead and use this X desktop group base directory specification. If you don't know what that means, it's essentially a standardized way that Linux and Mac kind of have these directories for where a binary should exist. So in case anybody's following this demo along later on, I don't want to be creating some random folder that the DSC team is going to hate forever. That they're like, wow, man, if Josh hadn't done that one demo, now everybody's saving, DSC to .dsc folder in their user profile. So we're creating this folder. And like I said, I already have compiled the application. And just for sake of simplicity, I saved it in my downloads. And I just did it here. And then I'm going to expand it out into my local bin folder that I just made. All right. So I already added that local bin folder to my path before the demo, right? So now I should be able to run DSC. So let's just take a second to look at this. So the DSC command is a native command, right? So it has built-in help systems for the command that the team is writing. You have basically subcommands and options. So if you're familiar with AZ or any other command line tool that's out these days, you're going to have subcommands and then various options that we can go. One that I think is going to be helpful for your learning is the completer. So the completer is a way to do shell completion. This is not unfamiliar. If you've used PowerShell, you've been like get dash a tab to get to the command you want to go to. At least that's what I do. So this completer script is something that the DSC team is providing for us that will allow us to have bash completion, elvish, fish, PowerShell, ZSH completion. So since I'm doing PowerShell, I want to get the PowerShell completion script. And I'm actually going to use one of my favorite tricks ever in PowerShell is just piping whatever you're having to clip, which puts it in your clipboard. And then we're going to open my profile in order to add it here. Now, if you're adding random scripts to your profile, you should always review it. I've already reviewed this one. It's a register argument completer. So it is essentially giving out all of the possible commands that DSC knows about. Maybe in the future, I'll have to actually update this if a new version of DSC comes out with a new subcommand. So just be aware of that. Also, a thing to be aware about with this too, and let me open a new shell so that profile is loaded, is it does the subcommands or the options, right? But it doesn't do any like value completing, right? So I should be able to be like bash and BA doesn't complete. So you still have to know what values you're going to put in, but it at least gets you the command completion. All right, so this is about building DSC resources, right? So we're going to skip over some of these other subcommands, and we're just going to look at the DSC resource one. So DSC resource gives us a bunch of subcommands. We get list, get, set, test, delete, which is new for the latest pull requests from this last nightly build. We also get schema, export, and help. The one that we're going to look at first is we're just going to look at what's built into the box. So what we get here is we get a list of all of the DSC resources that are available inside of our path, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be stored in that same folder that I created, but it could be stored anywhere. Now, if it is a PowerShell DSC resource that is going to be used through the Microsoft.dsc PowerShell, I believe, it's still going to be discovered through your PS module path variable. But anything that's a native binary resource is going to be found in your path. So we got different types here. You've obviously got the type, you've got the kind, resource, and adapter. Adapter is a special kind that is more or less like you could think of as a meta resource. And then there are the capabilities. So you have get, set, X meaning export, T meaning test, D actually meaning delete, and then E export. Actually, E is export. I honestly don't know what X is. Michael, do you know what X is? It probably exists. Yeah, I know. It was like added like last night. OK, so we'll say EX exists, but we'll get clarity on that. Read the documentation. That's what I'll say. All right, so for the resources, one of the subcommands, if you didn't see this, is there is schema. So we can get the JSON schema for a resource. So this right now is kind of if you want to do some discovery of yourself, what can I do with this specific resource? So let's actually start looking at resource schema. And let's look at the help really quick. So the subcommands are the options that we have to give to any kind of subcommand, right? Could be what resource are we looking at? So -r -- resource, -format for what we want to see out. So for this specific one, let's just look at one of the test ones that are here. So test echo, that seems easy enough. All right, so this is YAML, right? I know I said we're going to need to know JSON, but this is YAML for us to read easily. We get the schema for this specific resource. Now, this schema is jsonschema.org. This is just a generic schema that's allowing basic data types and various standard structures for a schema. So the title of this is echo. The type is going to be object. We have a required field here. So you can think of this as like a required parameters if you're coming from PowerShell world. So a required parameter for this resource is output. If we look at the properties being defined, we have output defined here. And then we have this weird reference. This is kind of a shortcut inside of YAML and JSON where you can make a kind of a reference to a different location in the file so that you don't have to define everything in one spot. You can have your definitions down below, and then you can have a kind of simplified properties section above. So if we go to the root of the document, right, which is up here, and then we go down to definitions, which is down below, we can then see what are the definitions for output. So we can have any kind of array, we can have any kind of Boolean, integer, int64, or string, right? That's pretty straightforward. That means that we can't do stuff like a float, right? We can't put in some super large number into this test echo. So let's go ahead and actually just try and actually, one thing I wanted to show really quickly is, so the format by default is YAML for you to read as a human. But you can say, I want it as JSON. I don't know why you would want to do it like this, but you can also do JSON pretty. Actually, I think it's pretty JSON, sorry. You can do pretty JSON, and you kind of get it expanded out. Something to keep aware of, though, is that even though you're seeing it as test echo and it's being printed to the screen as YAML, if we pipe this to out default, the command is always passing JSON. So this is probably one of the first most important lessons to learn about this new version is DSC is always passing out JSON and is always wanting to accept JSON. Even though you might be able to have different decorations of YAML or pretty JSON, it's always passing JSON. So keep that in mind. All right, so let's actually just test one of these inbox resources really quick. So let's try and do a get. We'll do it against that test echo again. So these are the different options you can provide. So you can provide all to get all instances of a resource. It's not going to make much sense with our test echo example here. You're going to have to define what the resource is with -r. And then the -i or the -p. You can provide input to the JSON either via standard in, so piping it into this command, or -i and then providing your JSON object there, or -p if you want to have a path to a file that is JSON that is going to be consumed by this. We won't focus on the -p, but we will do the -i quite a bit. So let's go ahead and say we're going to do the resource test echo. And then we're going to do something that I kind of have gotten used to for so many years, as I'm sure you might have done. I like to create hash tables, right? And then convert them to JSON, because I always forget how to write the JSON format. Also, what I've done is I've just aliased for myself. I don't know why these aliases don't exist, but convert to JSON is CTJ, convert from JSON is CFJ. I just instantiated those in my profile. Oh, yes, thanks for the catch. All right, so no reason to clap because this isn't that impressive, but we've just taken a PowerShell hash table, we've converted to JSON, we've put it into this test echo, and DSC has told us, hey, the actual state is obviously going to be the output because there was no previous state for this DSC resource. And of course, we can change the formatting, we can have it pretty JSON or we can have it regular JSON. I'm not going to bore us with that. But the same would be true for a set, right? So we're going to go ahead and set a resource. And before state is an output, and the after state is obviously an output. If it was different for some reason, which we'll see that later on, you would see that in change properties. What properties are specifically different between the before and after state? All right. Any questions yet? Anything that I covered so far that was curious about the DSC resources built in? Yeah?
When you were listing the available ones from Microsoft and stuff, did those come with the binaries that you grabbed, or are they somewhere else you gotta go get?
Yeah, so the question was about the DSC resources that I saw. Were they with the DSC that I got, or do I have to go get them somewhere else? Currently, those are all inside of the DSC repo. So when I compiled DSC last night, it gave me everything that was kind of in that folder path, and it gave me it all as like one thing. If you download the alpha version, it'll have all of those binaries in that as well. So those currently are all kind of in box when you install DSC. I'm not sure if that's the future, if there's going to be some kind of like DSC v3 registry, or if there's going to be some kind of like ACR feed you can go download from. I'm not sure, but right now it's all in box. Any other questions? Okay. So real quick, I'm going to kind of step back for a second from just looking at the demos and talk about lifecycle. How many in here actually went to school to be a software engineer or a designer or write code for a living? Couple people? I mean, who's done it after they've been in a job and they've gotten interested in it and they're like, I'm going to do night classes now? Okay, yeah. That's my journey. I started as an IT pro. Actually, my degree wasn't even in technology. That's a whole other conversation. If you want to catch me at the happy hour tonight, I'm happy to share that story. But I have no background in software development, right? And I've slowly learned this stuff as I've gone. So being that DSC v3 resources are compiled code, you have to start thinking about it more than just writing your scripts. You have to think about it as a software engineer. How do you go through designing a solution that will survive? There's lots of patterns for software development that have been already shared where people have solved these big problems that will protect you from running into issues. So usually that life cycle includes designing, right? Before you start to just go away at a solution, right? Writing a script, what are we trying to solve? Why are we trying to fix it? What are we trying to fix? A question I've been asking lately of myself is like, has somebody else already solved this problem? Like, why am I gonna like invest my time trying to figure this out? During this design, if you need to, and probably a good idea is to start thinking about like a threat map, right? Like we live in a pretty scary world now, and you might want to start thinking about like, what could go wrong with this software that I'm about to write? How can I mitigate against that? Is there any approval I need to get from my management, my team to like implement a new solution? Then you enter into developing, how are we actually solving this problem? What language are we going to use to do it? At this phase, you can start to actually use tools like linting and various security scanners as you like start to develop. And then you start to get into building, and the real question is will it compile? Like that's what I ask every time I was preparing my demos for this talk. And that's going to probably be a good iteration of trying to build it. And then testing, obviously, CI/CD pipelines, making sure does it integrate with whatever I'm trying to work with. And then finally, you get it deployed, and how is it running in production? Is it still running? Maybe there needs to be telemetry in whatever you're putting so that you can tell when it breaks. We have some of these things that have already been gifted to us through this community and learning how to do PowerShell because people are building test frameworks, people are building monitoring frameworks, all sorts of things for us. But we don't think about it necessarily when we start writing a script because it's so easy to write a script, run it, okay, it's fixed my problem, but we don't think about the cycle. But with a resource, you're probably going to have to think about these problems. So the first DSC v3 resource that we're going to write here is actually going to just focus on the JSON. So we're going to look at tzutil. Tzutil is a built-in Windows application. It's native on Windows. It's in System32. We don't have to add it to our path at all. It's already there. It's imperative by design, meaning that you have to give it specific arguments to make it do something. It doesn't understand JSON. It was probably written long before JSON was a thing. And obviously, it doesn't output any JSON to us. So we got to think of a way to kind of like craft this into our specific scenario. So let me go ahead and clear the screen here again, although it's already cleared. One of the subcommands that I didn't show yet, but is the DSC schema command. And this allows us to actually look at different schemas that the DSC v3 engine is looking at for understanding different objects that are being passed around. You can do get results, set results, test results, DSC resources, resource manifests, and then a whole bunch for configurations. We're ignoring all of the configuration stuff for this part of the talk since we're just focused on DSC resources, but it is fascinating to look at how those work. So let's go ahead and look at the DSC schema for the type of resource manifest. So just like we saw on our previous exploration here, this is going to be a JSON schema. It's rendered in YAML, but it gives us what is required for a resource manifest. Now, a resource manifest is what DSC is going to look for to understand how do I use whatever binary you want me to use as a resource, right? So this is actually the definition document that you give to DSC. What's only required is a schema, a get function, the type, which you can think of as the name, right? What type of resource are you having? And then a version so that it can tell like which version you want to pull in. Again, we're using this definitions shortcut here, so we have to actually scroll down here. And this is part of it that is very interesting. So all of the schemas are currently going to be published to the GitHub repo as of now. I don't know, maybe that it will change. I'm not quite sure, thinking about this, how this will work for potentially air gap scenarios at this point, but that might be something that you might be concerned about. But for this, basically we have a regular manifest, a bundled manifest, and then this manifest VS Code. We're going to specifically look at this one really quick. So again, JSON schema. We're going to see a lot of this today. This helps us define different things. One thing that we're going to do, let's go ahead and actually start launching VS Code. Oh, good. It launched it already for me. So these schemas basically exist so that DSC can interpret resources, and it helps you define what a resource should look like. So if you're ever wondering and there's no documentation, read the schema, you're going to know how the engine is going to be able to interpret it. One thing that came up yesterday about VS Code in one of the talks, right, is that VS Code is a skill that you'll learn and you'll never, never be regretful for learning. There's a lot of buried features inside of VS Code that I've been learning about. One of them is actually JSON schemas. So there is no DSC v3 plugin for VS Code, right? But because there is this schema for how to define a resource, how to define a config, we can actually reference that inside of our VS Code settings so that we start to get tab completion for building a DSC resource. So this should actually help you speed along development of these new resources. So this is just JSON.schemas. There's an article about actually how to implement this, but what it's going to do is any file that matches .dsc.resource.json, which is the naming convention you have to use, so the star being whatever you're naming it, it will then use this specific VS Code manifest to help us. So I don't need to save those settings because they're already present for me. So we want to implement tzutil. So let me clear back here. So tzutil, let's just run it. It has some pretty simple input. /g gives us the current time zone ID. /s allows us to set a time zone. And /l allows us to list a time zone. You know, we definitely have a get function in DSC. We have a set function in DSC. So this looks perfect for our use cases today. So going back here, let's go ahead and actually start creating a JSON. So the first thing that we need is a schema, as we talked about. Because I have that schema defined, I actually have all of the different potential resources that we need. I am going to use the 2310 because that's the latest reference doc. And I'm pretty sure I can just use this one. Let's see if it's the right one. OK, yeah, it's the bundled. That should be fine for us. The difference between the bundled and the non-bundled one is that the non-bundled one just makes references to other JSON documents out there, whereas the bundled one includes those reference links inside of the document. So it's just a larger JSON document that it is referencing. The other thing that we needed was we needed the type. So let's just say Microsoft tzutil. And then we need to have a version. So we're just going to say this is super alpha. We also need to have a get function. So let's say this. Now there's, let's see, there's two different versions here. There's kind of the simplified just run an executable, or there's run an executable with args, and you can take input from standard in, or you can take input from environment variables. Be aware this is probably one of the sections of this talk that is still under review, is changing. There is a pull request that Steve has where he is potentially changing the way that this input works. So just be aware of that. Also then we're going to need to have a schema definition. Now up here, this reference to a schema is reference to what this document should abide by, right? But this below is more of the schema for, okay, how do each one of these functions internally work? So what should get look like? What properties should I expect to take into this specific resource? You can come up with a schema two different ways. The command that you execute can export schema for you. That's, I think the suggestion from the team is that that's good if you're building something internally and you can kind of control that. If you're going to get into the business of publishing this out to like the gallery or out externally to other people, you probably want to have it as this other one, which is embedded, where you're going to have explicitly listed references to I'm aligning to this schema, and this is what you can expect. So you get the title of what the schema is, you get the type, you get what's required, what property IDs. So if I save this right now I have not made any modification to this besides hitting tab complete, right? And none of this says tzutil in it, so it shouldn't actually work for tzutil. But if I go ahead and if I copy JSON and this over to my home directory as tzutil DSC, all right, so if I copy that over there, then I should be able to do DSC resource list, right? And I do in fact have Microsoft tzutil, but I realize I misspelled Microsoft, so that's going to be a problem. So let me go back here. All right. So let's do that copy again, and now it is correctly spelled. Whew, I won't lose my job. So you can see that it has at least been registered, right? And that's at the bare minimum what you need to do to get something registered. But if we look at the schema, it's going to not make sense because we're trying to manipulate tzutil. So let's go to the next kind of file that I have with some ingredients already baked in here. So this looks a little bit better. So I'm actually going to be running the executable of PowerShell, right? And I don't have to provide the extension for the executable. DSC will figure that out for us. And then I can provide args. So I'm providing no logo, no interactive, no profile, command. And then I'm actually just running the executable, or I'm saying that the DSC should run the executable and then convert to JSON so that it can properly output it. Again, for some of these definitions down here, they still don't make sense. But if I copy this over, we can get a little bit better idea. And then if we do the schema of the resource, we're going to actually then have kind of, OK, time zone is required as an input object, and we don't actually have a good reference to that time zone yet, because it's missing. So let's go to the final kind of resource and what this looks like put all together. So inside of here, we're getting more description and tags. These aren't required, but they're nice to haves. We're still running a get command, so we're running tzutil, and we're taking that value, which is just a string, and we're putting it into this hash table and converting it to JSON, so that DSC, when it receives this information, it receives it as JSON, and then it can interpret it and prettify it with YAML or pass it along as JSON. For the set option, right, we have to do a little bit more with a specific example and receive in the input, convert it from JSON, manipulate it as we would PowerShell, pass it to the exe binary, and then return what is set back out to the system. And then finally, with test, we're going to be getting the value and then returning it and testing that that value is actually true. Now, and I also implemented export just because I was trying to play along with that functionality. And then exit codes, you can define custom exit codes for your binary. So in the future, if your binary decides to exit with a weird code, you can actually say like, oh, that's an OK, like this will be fine. Or you can say, oh no, this is an error. And then finally, down here for the definitions, I actually took and created an enum for all of the potential time zones of that tzutil, which is a lot. But then that allows you to have kind of like parameter input validation for your DSC resource so that you can say, hey, only pass in these values to what I'm trying to do. Now, again, I'm going to say something that was on the first slide. I'm not on the PowerShell team. I don't know if this is what they want doing, but just to try and figure out how DSC v3 works, it's the idea of like taking something that already exists that you have and wrapping it with this JSON document to say, this is how that you can use this as a resource with the DSC configs. So let's go ahead and copy this over, and then we'll start messing with this resource a little bit. So this is the final one. Final. And now we should be able to see, yep, we've got all of our time zones here in the enum. And time zone is still required. So let's go ahead and actually start doing some stuff here. So let's do a resource get. All right, so it's Pacific Standard Time currently. If we want to go and set it, I'm going to have to get the help here. So we can, again, provide input as a string. We can provide it as a path. We're going to do strings in this demo. So I think I'm going to be brave enough to write JSON without doing my little convert trick. So I'm really testing everybody here. All right, so we were able to set it. It was Pacific Standard Time. Now we're setting back to UTC. This is something that is going to be crucial here, though, is I'm going to try and set it back to PST, but PST isn't understood, right? And it's actually not PST, it's PDT, Pacific Daylight Time. That doesn't work either, because it's not the exact string in the enum that we were expecting. If you are used to being case insensitive with PowerShell, DSC v3 is case sensitive, just because it's going to be on Linux, Mac, cross-platform. So if I do something like a lowercase time, right, it's going to say it's not exactly matching. And actually, I didn't even spell time. I said Tim, so Pacific Standard Tim. Now, if I do time, it'll work for us and it'll switch it back. The good thing for this too is that we can add in our other parameters here, such as DST auth. But let's just go back to UTC for a second here and test. So if we do the test, right, it's going to try and do a validation of what exists on the system and what you're trying to set it to, and it's going to give you this differencing property. There is a synthetic test that is available. So in your resource, you could, in the set, there's a parameter that you can provide that says, I think it's synthetic test true or false. If you do that, you don't have to actually write a test function, and it will kind of do a synthetic test for you by trying to do almost like a what if set, and then it'll give you back what would change. So that kind of allows you to have a little bit more flexibility in your resources that you're writing. Any questions so far? Yeah.
So in your resource, are you just wrapping this in PowerShell just for the output to make it JSON rather than just calling the executable itself?
Yeah. So that's the key thing. DSC, right, needs to get JSON objects and it needs to send JSON objects. That's its only language that it understands. So since tzutil doesn't output JSON natively, we have to come up with a way to output it natively. Convert from JSON is the easiest way that I could come up with in a short demo like this. If your binary, which we'll look at here in a second, if your binary outputs JSON natively, you don't have to run it in PowerShell like this. This is just for a command that doesn't understand JSON, but you have PowerShell available to you as a executable. Any other questions so far? I know that this was kind of an interesting topic the other day about defining code in JSON, so I was expecting to get a little bit more questions about that. All right, let me close that window for a second, and we'll go back to slides. All right, so the next demo that we're going to do here is TS Toys, and this stands for Tailspin Toys. It's a fictitious company. This actual application was written by Mikey Lombardi from the DSC docs team. He wrote it in the DSC samples repo that's out on GitHub. It's a great kind of learning resource that you can have. I actually used it when I was trying to learn, obviously, what's going on here. So this is just a fictitious application. Think of it as an enterprise business application you have internally that you need to interface with. It's a native binary or it's a web service. In this case, it's just a native binary. It's imperative by design. You pass an argument to this command to make it do something. This application is a little bit more modern, so it does use JSON as its backing config, but it doesn't understand JSON input or output, just like tzutil. So we kind of have to think about how do we interact with this binary. And again, it comes from the DSC samples repo. So let's go back to our lab. All right, so like I said, I already compiled this Go binary, and I put it in my path so that it's available to me. The one thing about this command that is kind of handy is you can see the config with show. Not that it matters, it just has either automatic updates and the frequency that it should check for updates. And it has a machine config and a user config. If we do tstoy show path, we can actually see the path where the JSON config exists for this application. So that's at least handy to have, so we can figure out where we might need to manipulate JSON for this application. And if we actually do something like test path, we can do tstoy show path user. Right? That file does not currently exist on this demo lab. But we will create it and make it with our DSC resources so that this application can properly run and function on our system. All right, so let's go back to opening VS Code for this. Probably don't need Edge open anymore. And let's close this folder. All right, so for the C#, so I decided to write this in C# just because it's has very similar syntax to what we might be familiar with seeing in PowerShell, at least with the object model and dot sourcing and methods and properties. The tools that I installed for this was just the C# dev kit from Microsoft. It's really handy. It allows you to do .NET application right inside of VS Code. Again, going back to that comment of invest in learning Visual Studio Code, and you won't have to necessarily learn a new tool every time you learn a new language. All right, so inside of the .NET project that we have, we basically have all of our folder structures, and we have the primary program CS folder. I'm not going to go line by line through this program, just because I'm not sure that we would have the time to do that with some of the other stuff we're going to go over. But I did at least want to kind of like highlight some ideas that maybe you need to start thinking about when you are designing your resources. The first off is, since DSC is going to be executing your executable, your resource that you're writing, you either need a way that can handle standard input parsing, or you need to have a very good way of handling arguments to your executable in a very good way. And what I mean by that is, if you're going to write a command line application and you haven't done one from scratch before, has anybody written a command line application or script in Bash before? Right? Yeah. You're like, I've got to figure out how to parse arg. So I've got arg0, that's like the command, and then I got arg1, which is like the first thing being passed in, and then I got arg2. So now I'm like hard coding where my args are at. And so now then I have to parse, well, arg0 should be an int, or no, arg1 should be an int, arg2 should be a string, and then you just like kind of get into like, you're managing, how do I handle arguments to a command? Don't do that. Get yourself a library in whatever language you're writing in that is a argument parser like library. In this case, I used system command line, which is, I believe, still in preview, but it's from .NET, and it basically allows you to define what parameters, what subcommands you're going to take into your command or your program. And then they kind of handle all of the test cases of like, is this the right data type? Is this everything else? And you don't have to think about that. You can write on your code, your business logic code. So in this program that I have, right, we have all of our options that we're being able to easily define. So I have the ensure option. So we want to ensure either it's absent or present. This is a little bit older naming convention. I think DSC v3 is moving towards the attribute of exists, true or false. So don't think of this absent present as being something that is a DSC thing. This is just for this demo application and how it works for the business. We're also then getting an input JSON, which allows us to take in a string or a JSON blob into the command. We have a scope, so user or machine scope, because for our TS Toys application, they have a user or machine scope config. And then that config also had update automatically and update frequency, so we should probably take that in as parameters or arguments to this exe as well. And then just for the sake of the export command in DSC, we need to just return everything out to the screen, which when I did TS Toy show, right, it showed the entire config, both user and machine config in one JSON blob. So I'm just trying to support interacting with this other application through these arguments. Now for this library, they've also kind of given some good commands for how do you create subcommands. So we have to create a root command, and then we have to create our get command and our set command. And the good thing about this is it makes you define help right along the way. So you don't have to build like a separate help system, which is another thing if you've ever written like a bash script or you've tried to write your own arg parsers, you're like, great, how am I going to handle if somebody does dash dash help? Now I have to write a help function that like outputs that to the screen. Don't do that. Save your time. Just use a library. So then we take our root command, which is going to be our C# tstoy, and we're going to add our subcommands such as get and set, and we're off to the races. Now something that is different, let me see if I can, okay, and commands. If you're coming from PowerShell, oftentimes, you are dealing with systems where you can just be like, yes, just do this, run this, get this back, right? But there's a concept of jobs where maybe you need to run something async or asynchronously, and you put it out in the jobs, you wait for it to run, and then once it's done, you kind of get the data back from it, and you can do other stuff. In like C# programming, concurrency is a big thing, and so this command library makes you run your commands asynchronously. So you have to basically run your command, let it do its work in the background so that the shell is kind of waiting for it to be done so it can do other stuff, and then it returns back to the command. So we have to set what's known as a handler. So the handler is more around what happens when somebody runs the get command, what happens when somebody hits the set command. We're basically taking in all of our input, and then we're passing it in here to make sure that we can handle, is the input coming from our parameter, or is it being piped into us, right? So that's kind of a key thing. Are we getting this as redirected from the pipe? So that's something that you need to consider too when you're writing your DSC resource in another language, is taking it in different ways. I think I learned this kind of the hard way, but I think DSC, or at least in the earlier versions and like some of the alpha versions that I was messing with, it was trying to pipe it into whatever command you had. Even if you had an argument that was like --JSON and you defined it as an arg inside of your JSON file, it still tried to pipe it in. I believe that might have changed, but you just need to be aware that you need to handle both kind of options for your binary. So we're reading in the config, and we're going to do some different manipulation with it. Another thing that you need to think about is serialization and deserialization. I mentioned that word earlier when we talked about YAML, and the idea that you're going to take something that's human readable and it's going to convert it into something that's machine readable, right? Inside of C#, you have to do this serialization, deserialization between what a JSON object is that you're going to use to write to a file or to pass out to DSC, and .NET objects that you can easily manipulate and pass around in other ways. So this deserialization needs to happen when we read the config in, whether it comes in from standard in or it's the file, and then when we put it out, we need to serialize it back to JSON so that we can write it. I ran into a bug, and this was just kind of some really interesting stuff to learn. Inside of C#, there's this system text JSON serialization library that is available to you. And every JSON object that you might have, in PowerShell, you would just define it as a hash table. And you just be like, yeah, this is the structure of my data, and I'm just going to convert it to JSON, and boom, it's a JSON file, magic, right? In C#, you have to actually define a class that represents your document. And the way that tstoy works is if it's machine or user config, there's no attribute for that in the config itself, because it's just a path. And if it's absent, the file's not going to be there. And if it's present, the file's going to be there, right? So those are kind of attributes that aren't in a JSON document, but I kind of want to represent as JSON to DSC to say this is absent, present, user, machine. But the file itself has a different JSON schema. So without going too much further down this, I basically created two different types of JSON representations. One that I'm actually using to write the file out to, and one that I'm using inside the program to represent to the screen and to DSC, this is what JSON object to expect. And the reason for that is that you can get into writing custom contracts in C# for JSON And that's like a whole other level I did not want to go into for this thing, because you're going down in the weeds here. So we basically have a class for our file structure, and then we have a nested class for the updates properties underneath of that file structure. And then we have basically our tstoy config, which is what DSC is more or less wanting, which is the ensure, the scope, the update automatically, the update frequency. So command line parsers, don't write it yourself, get a library. Deserialization, really think about what your config document is going to look like when you're passing it back out to DSC. Or when reading it from DSC, I should say, as well. So that's more or less the command that is being done. There was a couple other things that I had to think about here for helper functions. So since I'm looking for a specific path on my system, right, I have to, well, first off, I needed to see if tstoys existed. So I needed a function to say, does tstoy.exe even exist on this system? Because I don't want to run the resource if it doesn't exist. But then also, does the path exist? So I created this helper function to see, does the file exist? Whether it's a config file, whether it's a binary file, I'm going to need the same helper function. I created some helper functions for the deserialization of config, just as I mentioned, because I had two different types of JSON objects that I was deserializing and serializing all the time. And then obviously, I needed to go get the config path, and there was no environment variable to read that from. I needed to execute tstoy show path user, right, or tstoy show path machine. So for this, I'm using process start info, and I'm basically putting all the arguments together and executing a process. If you ever do this with PowerShell, there is a huge gotcha where you need to clear out the standard in, as it will collect and it won't clear itself out. So you need to dump that out frequently. And then we have basically our helper functions to read that config off of disk, and then obviously we're going to need a write function to write that config to disk. And we won't look at necessarily the internal logic of that. But this will be eventually pull requested into the DSC samples repo after the conference here. So you can go out and kind of look at this as an example in the future. But let's go ahead and actually compile this thing. So I'm actually going to use publish, which is basically you're going to compile your application as a release artifact, and then it will put it in all of the right paths that we want. I'm also doing something that you might need to think about specifically for C#, but I'm putting it as a self-contained application. So for any C# application, you need to have the .NET runtime available to you. So think about if you're writing this resource and you want to deploy it to the edge, right? And you're like, I have very little compute, very little storage, and I can't run .NET runtime. Or I can't install .NET runtime. So as a result, you basically put this as a self-contained application, and it will compile your app, but then it'll also put all of the binaries it needs to run a .NET application with it. So it'll be a lot larger, but then you don't take that runtime dependency where you might not have .NET installed. For other languages like Go and Rust and other things like that, you may not have to worry about that. Python, I think that they have the similar kind of concept for kind of a packaged application. But otherwise, you would have to make sure that you had the right version of Python on your destination system. So we're going to head and do that. And like any demo, just ignore the warnings about my coding. Just ignore those. All right, so we should now have this binary application, which did not exist before. So again, because of the library I'm using, all of this help is built in. I didn't have to write it, just based off the parameters. We get the general syntax here. It threw me a warning because a required command was not provided, because the only required commands are get and set. So let's do something like get, and then we can say scope. Actually, let's just do all really quickly. And you can see it went and ran, and it evaluated that, hey, the TS Toys user and machine config doesn't exist, right? So I think this is a huge thing about DSC v3 resources. I just wrote an application, right, that I could use irregardless of using DSC, right? I don't have to use DSC with this command that I just wrote. It's a resource. Now, I am writing it specifically to use with DSC, but think about that in your own scenarios, right? You could write your own command line tool that does something for somebody who needs to do something hands-on keyboard, but then you could also then build into that the featureability that supports DSC, so that you're not having to have two separate binaries. You still have one tool that your team is using. It just depends on, is a system running this, or is DSC running this, or am I running this as a user? So we kind of have the ability to manipulate this. If we wanted to do some actual setting, let's actually set up the user config. So input, I think it has to be all caps, yep, JSON. And we're going to go ahead and I'm not as comfortable doing the JSON for this one, so I'm just going to do it from my other trick. User, and we want it to be ensure present. And let's also add the update automatically to be true. Now that doesn't actually do anything, but imagine it did something for our command. And then we're going to do convert to JSON. And I got to wrap this, I think, just to make sure it runs first. All right, so if I run this, it went ahead and did what we asked it to do. If I do the all again, you can see now that that file actually exists through this DSC resource, and we're able to retrieve it. And then if we actually did the test path, so that you guys know I'm not lying, right? It does exist. So again, cool, Josh. That's a great exe, whatever. We're here for DSC, right? So just as we did with our other example, right? We would need to take that application that we wrote, and we would need to create a JSON manifest for it, right? Because that's how DSC knows that this is a resource that it can interact with. So, C# TS toy, it only takes the argument of get from standard in, right? C# TS toy, it takes the set from standard in. And this is the pretest that I was actually talking about, where you can say pretest to true or false, and that will do a synthetic test of your resource. And then for sets, you can have it return various things. So for my example here, we're doing state, but you can do state and diff if you wanted to get a little bit different output. And then, of course, down here, we're having to define our schema for this specific resource. So what is actually required? Scope is going to be required at all times, so user machine. Are we going to do ensure, update automatically, and update frequency? So apart from this, if I do DSC resource, even though I copied it to my bin file to the exact same place that we've been putting stuff, if I do resource list, I don't see any TS toy stuff, and that's because that JSON file doesn't exist. So we need to do copy TS toy. Oop, let's see. And we're going to copy this over to our home. All right, so now we should be able to do this again, and now we do have our manifest there so it can understand what we're going to do. Now, I guess you could have the problem of the inverse here, right? Where you have a manifest present and then the binary doesn't exist. That's kind of awkward. But I think in reality, you probably would need to make sure that that binary exists, or DSC, I believe, will just kind of throw in failure generic error that, hey, this resource didn't execute properly. So we're gonna do the same thing we just did with the C#.exe, but we're gonna do it now with DSC. So it's gonna be cooler, right? So if we're going to do get, we're going to have to say get, and then what resource are we going to do? And it's tstoy.example, and then C#tstoy. I really wish that the argument completer did like a completion for all of your resources. That would be awesome. All right, so doing that, we can actually get, and I'm realizing this as I'm looking at this, this doesn't tell you clearly with the actual states here. Well, I guess you see machine and user, but there might be a state where if you had something that wasn't saying what scope it was, this all command could just give you a bunch of things that look very similar as a resource if you don't define your schema very clearly to say, what is this coming from? And you could just basically get the same properties like 100 times, and you're like, oh yeah, file exists. And you're like, what file? I don't know what file you're talking about. So anyway, so we just exported out all of our configs here. So again, let's go ahead and try and do set for this specific resource. I'm going to be no, I'm not going to be risky. I thought I was like, I'll just pipe it, but I don't think that that's going to work on this function for right now. Present, and we are going to also say, let's make the machine config exist. And that is going to be, scope is going to be machine, and then convert to JSON. And this is what I was afraid of. So I found a bug in my demos when I recorded this. And then I reset my VM, which means I lost my code that I found. So what I'm doing here, and we have about 15 minutes left. So does anybody want to see me try and fix my C# code live? No. All right. Well, what is going on here, though, I know exactly the line of code, is that in my handler for get, yeah, my get command handler, I specifically did like, hey, handle input redirection, right? I never implemented the same standard in handling in my set command, right? So as a result, my get command handles standard in or piping in, but my set does not actually do that. I'm going to just do it. We're going to fix it on the fly and see if I can fix it. All right. That should be the right place to put it because I'm reading JSON config. Oh, actually, I'm creating the config there. That should be fine. Famous last words. All right, we're going to try and rebuild this thing and see if I can set it. And oh, I already did it there, so let's just try and do my set again. Oh man, look at that. Fix the code in the live demo. All right, so we use DSC to go ahead and hopefully, please don't clap. That's my not being prepared rather than anything. We just created the machine config using DSC. It was absent before, but now it's present. Yeah, so one last thing I guess we can do really quickly, and I don't think that this will work in this function because I have the pretest set to false. So actually, yes, this won't work. But yeah, so as far as like writing our code here, right, you're going to need to potentially learn a new language if you're going to be writing these binaries. It's a good opportunity. It's a good challenge. but you're going to have to learn a lot of these things. You're going to have to write a lot of stuff to handle your own errors, implementing different libraries that you've never used before. So let's go back to the slides. All right, so that's all I have for demos. But the summary for this talk, and I've said this over and over again, but you need to be able to read JSON, specifically JSON schemas, to understand what's going on. Command line parsers is going to be key for you. So don't write your own. Adopt a library for whatever language you're using. Think about deserialization as well. Adopt a good library for serialization and deserialization of JSON inside of your language, because everything is JSON. JSON, JSON, JSON. And actually, as I'm saying this, I'm thinking of a talk from years ago with Jason Helmick. But yeah, everything is JSON in DSC. So remember that. It might look like YAML, but it's JSON. And also your target application, your service that you're trying to write a custom DSC resource for, doesn't have to know JSON. It doesn't even need to be aware that it's being manipulated by another thing, right? And that should be the end state goal. And I guess one bullet point that's not on here is, DSC is not a configuration management tool. It's a low-level library API that you can rely on to interact, right? Bring your own config management tool, but use DSC to do the dirt down and in the weeds stuff. All right, any questions for the session? Anything that you want to ask me or can be related around DSC v3 if we didn't cover it?
I'm still not clear if the current class-based PowerShell resources being supported.
Yes, they will be. Yeah. Because what's going on there, and I can let Michael speak to this if you want to, but the way I understand it is that there is a built-in DSC resource that will shim out to use the PS desired state configuration module to run those, right? Yep. Let me go back there real quick. I was just going to do that. So DSC resource list. Yep. So I believe it is going to be this one right here. And also, does anybody use the script-based DSC resource? It's not it's written in line in a MOF or a config. I've seen a lot of script resources in various places that I've worked, and they never move it to a properly life-cycled managed one. So I believe also there's going to be an adapter that's going to be kind of working with that, and Michael mentioned that yesterday in his talk. So there'll be another resource there too. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much. Please feel free to give me feedback on the talk today. And if you have any questions about DSC, I know PowerShell team and the DSC team is here this week. So please feel free to reach out to them and talk to them. So thank you so much.